Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I'm your host, Owl Medicine, and today's topic that matters is a continuation of the previous 3 episodes. In the last 3 episodes, you have learned about the ACE study, strengthnesses, and examples from my life of the wonderful outcomes that are possible when you rethink broken and you leverage your strengthnesses. So today, I'm going to be filling in some gaps between when you initially decide to rethink broken and the amazing outcomes that are possible when you lean into your strengthnesses. For those of you who may not have heard the previous episodes, go back and take a listen to those if you want more detail, but I'll briefly cover what was covered in the previous 3 episodes in order so you understand where we're headed. ACEs are an abbreviation for Adverse Childhood Experiences, and that term was coined in 1997 at the end of the ACE study, which was the first ever study of its kind. And basically what they did was they asked a series of questions about childhood adversity and then correlated the answers to those questions with health outcomes later in life. The effects were absolutely astounding. It shocked the entire medical community. What we learned from ACEs is that there was a direct correlation between childhood adversity and health outcomes later in life. Things like everything from suicidal ideations to heart disease, ischemic heart disease, COPD, stroke, cancer, diabetes, all kinds of stuff. But I didn't bring up ACEs to talk about the chronic health effects. The reason I chose to talk about ACEs is because I'm speaking in these 4 episodes altogether to people who have identified as broken, who do identify as broken or have at some point in their life. Those of us who have identified as broken, we have a hard time telling exactly how broken we are, because part of the way that we have survived is usually to whatever we've survived. We downplay the things that we survived and we say, oh, other people had it worse. And that allows us to keep moving. Totally true. However, that means that we usually don't have a good idea of the kinds of stress that we went through and how that might affect us, because in order to get through it, we have to have some level of denial. So ACEs, in this case, are acting for broken people as a way to judge exactly how broken are you, right? And the ACEs are just 10 questions that in no possible way encompass all of the adversity that a child can face. It's just 10 very narrow categories. They're good categories, and it's a good yardstick, but it is a little bit incomplete. But for those of us who have identified as broken, it's a really good way to know how much adversity you may have had to overcome, and you can get an idea as to how different the structure of your brain is. Because that's the point of the end result of the science, is to drive home into our brains, the people listening right now, to drive home into your heart the fact that if you had childhood adversity, if you had lots of childhood adversity especially, you are physically, measurably, biologically different than your counterparts who did not have as much said adversity. That's the purpose of the strengthness, is to kind of give yourself a 1 to 10 score of how messed up you might be, and to get a little bit of some umbrella areas of things that you had to deal with, and to see how these different types of adversity show up later on in life, because different types of adversity change us differently. We respond differently to them. The next episode I did was on strengthnesses, and strengthnesses are basically your body's coping mechanism for ACEs. The more ACEs that you have, the stronger your strengthnesses are, because your strengthnesses are the aspects of your personality that protected you over and over and over and over and over again. If you're a fighter, one of your strengthnesses is that you're a fighter. There are times to fight, and there are times not to fight. And the reason it's a strengthness is because a strength and a weakness combined is a strengthness. So that's that episode. That episode is there to help you understand that your strengthnesses are directly related to the abuses that you suffered. And that those strengthnesses are the aspects of your personality that you leaned on over and over and over again to protect you from whatever adversity that you faced. And so essentially, those pieces of your personality get developed and developed and developed and developed and developed until you kind of turn into a one-trick pony. And that's a lot of what us broken people are. That's what we feel we are. We are clearly more than that, but most of the time, that's all we are because that's all that we act as. We're a one-trick pony. We identify ourselves with our trauma and with our brokenness and our inability to adapt ourselves to any situation. We just go, I'm this person and this is what I do. The whole concept of the book is if you rethink broken, if you are willing to do that and you identify as broken, it's a very, very difficult thing to do. And the reason that you feel broken is directly related to these strengthnesses. Because in one situation, if you're a fighter, say, then you need to fight, then that is a strength because you will be able to stand up and do what you need to do in that moment, and the outcome will be positive because of it. And if you are in a situation where you're a fighter and fighting is only going to make things worse, but you can't stop from fighting, that makes that a weakness. So the deciding factor that chooses which side of the strengthness coin is going to show up in any given situation is the environment. Because essentially these strengthnesses are aspects of our personality that we leaned on so much and so often that they became so well developed that we can't shut them down. We can't turn them off. They're such a huge piece of who we are because they have protected us from so much that we can't just turn that piece of us down. We can't just shut that off. I'm sure you've heard people say, or maybe said yourself, it's not a light switch. I can't just flick it off. And that's very much what is happening with people who identify as broken. When they're talking about those things, what they're talking about often are those strengthnesses. And then in the last episode, I gave some examples from my own personal life of how I took my own personal beliefs about myself, the ones that weren't great, and how I twisted one into becoming a useful thing, but not totally solved. And I told some stories about how my strengthnesses got to show up as strengths in really profound situations in ways that just rocked my world and just really made profound impacts on my being. But there's a lot that happens from the time that you first decide to rethink broken, and you take an inventory, you look at your aces, you see where you kind of lie on that scale, you identify some strengthnesses, and that's where you should be at this point if you've been following along. You should know what your ace score is, you should know what your strengthnesses are, and you should be a little inspired from the stories, hopefully anyway, from the last episode about ways that you can leverage your own strengthnesses to live a better, more fulfilled life. So hopefully that's where you are right now. If you are, congratulations, we're moving through the next phase, which is laying out the game plan. There's a game plan that's very necessary for Rethinking Broken. The reason it's so necessary is because Rethinking Broken is a process and not an event. It doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens over a very, very long, drawn-out, arduous process. The two things that are the most important in Rethinking Broken are time and consistency. Because when you rethink broken, you're rethinking your identity. You're rethinking who you are, especially if you identify as broken. The more you identify with the word broken or being broken, the more of you are going to have to readdress and find new ways to think about. Because the problem with being broken is when something goes wrong, you go, oh, it's because I'm broken, and you just blame everything on yourself. And there is no way to have good self-esteem if everything going on around you that goes wrong around you is your fault. There is no way to build good self-esteem if you feel that you are inherently flawed, that there is something inherently dysfunctional about you. That's the worst feeling on the planet, that no matter how good things are, you didn't give to the good because you're too broken. And when things are bad, it's clearly your fault because you're broken. I lived way too many years of my life feeling that way. And I don't ever want anyone to feel this way ever again. So if you are ready, you know your aces, you know your strengthnesses, and you feel motivated to getting to a place where you can have these amazing conversations with PhDs who are living out of a squat in Tijuana after their village got burnt to the ground. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, go back and listen to the last episode. If you're ready to dive into all of this, come with me. As you move through this process, things are going to knock you off your horse. And the trick is to get back on it. That's the only trick. There is no real trick. It's just do the work. Do the work of getting back on it. Expect that you're going to mess up, and expect that when you mess up, you're going to want to chuck in the towel and say, oh, well, clearly this doesn't work. I'm too broken. And that's the end of it. That's not good enough. That's not going to get you anywhere. You've got to keep trying. When you get knocked off, you have to be ready for it. Now, there's tons of skills and things I cover in the book, and I'm sure you already have ways when something goes bad that you have ways of getting yourself back to feeling okay, like you can do the work that you need to do. But early on, it's really early on in the rethinking. Early on in the Rethinking Broken process, when those moments come and you do get knocked off of your horse, it can be really demoralizing. And that's the reason I'm laying out this blueprint. There's a few things that you need to know. It's going to take a really, really long time. And the other really important thing to know is all humans inside of ourselves, we are all constantly trying to make sense of everything. And we all have our own cognitive dissonances, but most of us have a really hard time with cognitive dissonance. We don't like when we have two thoughts or a belief in a thought and those things don't work out very well. We work really hard to make everything in our own internal logic, at least, congruous. And because of that, when you go to Rethink Broken, which is essentially changing your identity, and in changing that identity, you're also changing your core belief system about yourself. When you change your core belief system about yourself and about you being broken, everything else is changed. If you think of yourself as a tapestry or a fabric, if you pull one string on that, it affects everything else that is connected, which is everything else, because it's one tapestry. But at the center of that tapestry are our core beliefs, the things that we believe about the universe, about ourselves, and about the world that we live in. And when you change one of those, it messes with everything. And I do really mean everything. You can change or tug on a string on the corner of a tapestry and you'll only affect a few things on the edges. But if you dig a nail into the center stitches and give it a big yank, you have just changed the structure of the entire thing. And in this case, the entire thing is you as a person. So as you can assume, this gets really messy, and it gets really messy really quickly. As soon as you start working on those big important ones, which is what you should be working on basically first, you will have a bunch of adjustments that you have to make. And you'll be adjusting so much and asking so many questions, it's really, really easy to get lost. So before you get too lost, let me just lay out the basics of the game plan. Game plan, rule number 1, expect to mess up. Number 2, we just covered it to death. Expect everything to change. Expect everything to change in a good way, eventually, in an uncomfortable way at first. Expect your subconscious assumptions to be challenged. Expect to feel weird and stuck and dumb for no reason at all. The reason is because these assumptions that you have are being challenged subconsciously. So the next tip is to make those subconscious assumptions conscious, which means you have to ask yourself throughout this whole process, that's interesting. I wonder where that came from. I wonder why I did that. And the answers to those questions usually lie in what previous memories or scenarios have I gone through in my life that are similar to this one, and look at what you needed to do to get through. You'll understand why you behaved the way that you did now. If you can pull those subconscious assumptions to the conscious and you can look at them directly, you will have a way, way easier time than I did going through this. I constantly am trying to pull my subconscious assumptions to the conscious, but it's really hard. The next is that we need a short-term plan and we need a long-term plan. We need plans for us broken folks. We need a plan for the ways that we're going to go about, like, not cursing out our boss or freaking out on people and doing or breaking down in inappropriate times or any of the things that make us feel super duper broken in the moment. We need ways to help cope with that, which is like distress tolerance skills and stuff like that. But there's a second set too. The first one is there to make sure that you don't act a fool and make a bad situation worse or a neutral situation into a bad situation. The next ones are the things that we do to change our brains for the long term. It is very difficult to change a brain. It is possible. And the last whole half of the book are mostly long-term ways that are scientifically proven on how to change your brain. And basically, it's all about fire together, wire together. So that's a basic neurologic principle that neurons that fire together get wired together. And with neurons that are wired together are called circuits. And we have circuits for just about everything. We have circuits for specific thoughts that we have. We have circuits even for our core values. We have circuits in our brains that light up together to accomplish a goal. In order to change our brains long term and to not feel broken, essentially what we have to do is get those habits that cause us to do the wrong thing at the wrong time and then make us feel broken, to make those habits no longer habits. And that has to do with changing your brain and changing the wiring and the structure of your brain. You have to change those circuits. And so the last half of the book has like in vivo skills, which are those skills to help you stop making a bad moment worse or from making a neutral moment into a bad moment. And then the rest are all to help you establish long-term emotional stability. And those you already know. I've covered a bunch of them. I've covered mindfulness. I've covered movement. I've covered journaling. I haven't really had a chance on this podcast to cover food and nutrition yet, but I will. And one more last thing that I really think is cool about this, and I'm excited for people to read about, is how interesting theater is in the long-term healing process. So this seems kind of bizarre, but hear me out on this. theater is a magical, magical way for people with extreme amounts of adversity to get to finally experience what life is like for someone else. For people who have lived in tons of abuse and neglect and harsh environments, they cannot imagine a world that's different than that. It just doesn't make sense. They can't even imagine one because their strengthnesses are so strong, they're so great, that they can't allow the cognitive dissonance to even entertain the idea that the world could be a fun and loving and beautiful place and people could treat them well. And theater is a magical way to help these people because they get to literally be someone else, which is super cool because when you try on theater, you get to play kings and slaves and servants and knights and bards and just all kinds of things. You get to be all of life. You get to be and play any character that you want to be or play. And that's cool up front. But what's so amazing about it is through acting out and through the process of acting, you get to become, even just for a few moments, someone else. You get to say the words someone else would say. You get to be treated the way someone else has been treated, even if it's just scripted. It doesn't matter because you're getting to experience something that you've never experienced before. That is evidence against your cognitive bias that says the world is a horrible, terrible place because it's been horrible and terrible to you. And yes, it can be, and it is a horrible and terrible place. And it can and has been horrible and terrible to many people. But it doesn't have to stay that way forever. The best part of a horrible childhood is typically that the worst part of your life is behind you. That's the best part. The best part of a horrible childhood is that the worst is behind you. The worst part is that even though the worst is behind you, we can't imagine it being any other way. And so although the worst may be behind us, many of us live our lives not that way. We continue to experience the world in similar ways that we experienced it as a child because we are unaware that it's not us that's broken. It was the world that was broken, and we adapted to the world. We adapted to the environment in which we were raised. We aren't the broken ones. The world is. We adapted to its brokenness. And if you had to adapt a whole lot to that brokenness, those strengthnesses have nothing to do. Your strengthness, the thing that loves you the most and has protected you the most through the worst things in your entire life, is now sitting around with his thumb up his butt, trying to figure out how to protect you. And that's why you act out all crazy, is because it's still trying to help. Even though the threat is gone, your strengthness is still trying to help. So you have to exercise it like a little puppy. You have to exercise your strengthnesses like a little puppy, and that's the environment changing that happens after we identify our strengthnesses. We have to put ourselves in environments, and I know it sounds weird, but you have to put yourself in safe environments that remind you of the uncertainty that you were raised in. If you can find a way to mimic your strengthness that you created in childhood, and you can use that strengthness as an adult and show the strong side of it, then the weak doesn't force its way into other aspects of your life. One of the hallmarks of trauma is avoidance. We avoid things that remind us of our traumas. So we avoid situations that remind us of our abusers. We avoid situations that remind us of our abuse. But if you are willing to safely put yourself in places that are similar, like being a kickboxer or being a paramedic, being a doctor or a nurse. Those things allow your strengthness to do its job and allow you to feel competent. And that's really important because most of us broken people, we feel broken because we feel incompetent. And we feel incompetent because the thing that we worked on the most, our strengthness is the thing that we worked on the most, wasn't even our choice, but it is what we worked on the most. That thing that we developed as well as we possibly can gets totally and utterly ignored because we are avoiding traumatic situations. That's why we needed a blueprint. That's why we need a blueprint. There's a lot that's happening through this process. So now I've given you enough details that you should be able to know. And if you haven't, go back and listen to them. I know I've said it 1,000 times, but the ACE study, you learn what ACEs are, you get your ACE score, you know what kind of situations you were exposed to, you know what strengthnesses you developed because you were protecting yourself from these adversities in your early life. And then, as any smart person would do, we tend to try to avoid situations that remind us of our trauma, but then that renders our strengthnesses totally useless. But anyone or anything as strong as our strengthnesses is not going to shut up so easily. So you will get the strengthness. It'll show up in your life, but it won't show up as a strength. It'll only show up as a weakness if you don't give it a chance to do its job. So we can't be avoidant. That's one of the biggest bottom lines. We cannot be avoidant with our traumas. We cannot be avoidant with what we've learned. We have to look at it all head on and dive on in. And that's a lot of junk to dive into, which is why we needed an episode about the game plan. Because there's so many things happening simultaneously. You can see it easily leads to getting lost, and you will get lost at some point in this process, probably multiple times. Hopefully, if I've done my job, it will be less time lost than I spent time lost, but you never know, I suppose. I really hope this helps to fill in some gaps. I really hope that you understand how I have formulated this whole concept from beginning to end of development and the way we're supposed to normally develop and what happens when we don't get to normally develop that way because of adversity in our young life, and the ways that we protect ourselves from the adversity and how those aspects of who we are develop over time and how they function in different environments and how that can lead to a really bad sense of self and this concept that we are broken when we really aren't. You really aren't broken. You really are a highly trained specialist working in the wrong field. So I hope this helps. If you've made it this far in the podcast, thank you so much for listening. If you liked what you heard and you're interested in more about Rethinking Broken, you can go to rethinkingbroken.com. There's more great information there, as well as a link to the Patreon that is helping to support and pay for the book and the book editing costs. There you will be able to access each of the rough drafts as I have written them. I release a chapter every month to my Patreon subscribers. So if you're interested in reading more about the book or interested in seeing at how terrible of a writer I was when I started and how I'm only slightly better now, then you can go sign up and read all of those and see how I have improved and see how the book has formed itself over time, if you care to support in that way. If you don't, or if you do, thank you so much for listening. Thank you so much for your time. And remember, stay blessed and stay uncomfortable.